enw Matilda. Mae hi'n ddiflas iawn ond yw. Mae ei gŵr, William, dyna fe, yn gadael ar ei long. Mae hi'n poeni nawr wnaeth ddod yn ôl, achos mae gwaith peryglis iawn da fe i'w wneud. O, mae'n ddrwg da fi fod mod ar nghwrtais. Mabel ydw i, a dacw fy ngŵr Hugh. Hugh y Fleminiwr mae pawb yn ei alw. Felly mae'n siŵr mae Mabel y Fleminwraig ydw i. Beth bynnag, beth am Matilda? Rheswm arall ei bod yn ddiflas yw ei chyfoeth. Tywysoges ydy hi gyda llaw. A hi sydd wedi talu am long William, y Mona. Ac efallai bydd hi'n teimlo'n ddrwg iawn petai pethau'n mynd o le. Mae William, dig yn Normaniaid, yn cychwyn allan am Loegr, lle mae e'n gobeithio ymladd y Saeson a chymeryd drosodd y wlad. Mae e'n uchelgeisiol iawn. Ond pwy ydy'r rhain sydd gyda fe?
The invasion force that went to England under William's command in 1066 comprised a combination of different peoples. There were Normans, obviously, Norman aristocracy, who were hoping to make great wealth out of this. But there were others from northern France, from Boulogne, from Maine, and also from Brittany and Flanders as well. And these forces were going, I think, partly, according to the early Norman historian William of Poitiers, because they believed in the justness of William's cause, that he really should be the next king of England, but also because they hoped to be rewarded. And this could imply that, in a sense, these people were mercenaries, or some of them, that they were expecting payment for their contribution. And at the very least, they expected to get lands and other rewards if the conquest succeeded.
There must almost certainly have been a sizable Flemish contingent, because the Flemings were mercenaries in the early 12th, 13th centuries. We know, for example, even as late as 1210, King John had numerous Flemish mercenaries in his army when he went to Ireland. So they were a very warlike, hardy race, and there must have been a very significant Flemish contingent at Senlac Hill, which won the Battle of Hastings on the 14th of October, 1066.
Rhyfelgar? Hugh? Dim tebyg. Wel, efallai ei gyndadau. Cyn y frwydr fawr honno galwyd William yn William y Bastard. Ddim yn enw neis iawn yn yna diw. Ond ar ôl ennill, newidiwyd ei enw i William y Conqueror. Dyna ddangos iddyn nhw. Felly, roedd William nawr yng ngofal Lloegr, gyda Matilda druan gartre. Tebygol o ddyn yn te. Ond roedd Matilda yn ddynes rhyfeddol iawn.
Well, Matilda is a fascinating character in history. She was the daughter of Baldwin V, who was the Count of Flanders. I think the marriage between Matilda and William actually had a lot of benefits for both sides. But we know, for example, that Matilda would have brought a significant amount of money into the Norman coffers. And of course, we know that she paid for the construction of his principal flagship, the Mona. And it was a marriage in which I think there was a genuine amount of love between both parties. For example, William took the crown of England in 1066. He gave her a coronation as befitting Queen of England on the 11th of May 1068, when he was abroad, because of course he now had England and all his continental possessions. Then of course he trusted her. She was his regent. And we know from various charters and documents that he trusted her implicitly. So there was a great deal it was a very successful marriage. It produced a large number of children, and I think it was a very advantageous match for both.
O, dyna braf. Yn yr amser yma, roedd Dyfed yn cael ei reoli gan ddyn o'r enw Rhys ap Tewdwr, ac fe arwyddwyd cytuneb rhyngddo fe a William. Roedd hi'n amser caled gyda pobl yn gweithio yn y caeau o fore cynnar, hyd at hwyr y nos, yn edrych ar ôl y defaid ag ati, I gyd ar lles y crachach. Roedd rhaid arbed y mysodiadau gan y Vikings, ond yna cafodd Rhys ei ladd gan y Normaniaid, ac yna newidiodd popeth. Daeth y Normaniaid I mewn I Sir Benfro a pharatoi y ffordd I gyndadau Hugh. Ond i'r bobl leol, roedd yn amser ofnadwy.
Well, the Norman invasion of Pembrokeshire was a major cataclysm for people there, and there was a contemporary poem actually by one of the clergy at St. David's complaining about the oppression and the undoing of the native aristocracy and the cruelty of the Normans, and clearly there was a lot of violence and destruction and the taking over of lands. And then the Flemings come, and they clearly do drive out the Welsh from one part, Tros, and take over. So you might see that almost as ethnic cleansing, but not, I think, necessarily killing the Welsh, but at least driving them from their lands and displacing them. So you have to think of a situation where you have major foreign invasion, conquest, displacement of people at this time, and a very big change in the social and political context of the inhabitants of Pembrokeshire.
Felly dyma ni, yn gyntaf y Normaniaid ac yna Fleminwyr yn cyrraedd. Pam ddaeth y Fleminwyr? Y bobl gyffredinol a ddaeth ar ôl y fyddin gyntaf a gadael eu cartrefi yn Flandris a dod i Sir Benfro. Yn ôl bob tebyg, mae'r hanesyddwyr yn methu cydweld.
The great Anglo-Norman historian William of Malmesbury, writing in his History of the Kings of England in 1125, has an interesting account of Henry I sending Flemings to Pembrokeshire.
The Welsh were in constant revolt, and King Henry maintained pressure on them by frequent expeditions until they surrendered. Also, in reliance on an admirable plan for reducing their ebullience, he removed into Wales all the Flemings who were living in England. Many Flemings who had trooped over in his father's time, relying on their kinship with his mother, were lying low in England in such numbers as actually to seem a burden on the realm itself. And so he collected them all together as though into some great midden in the Welsh province of Ross, with all their goods and chattels, thereby simultaneously purging his kingdom and putting a brake on his headstrong and barbarous enemies.
And therefore, this is really quite important evidence for why Henry sent Flemings there, and what they got out of it isn't explained so much by William, whose account is fairly brief.
The Chronicle of the Princes, I Bruti Tywysogion, is one of the most important documents in Welsh history, and that tells us of the arrival of the Flemings as a result of a catastrophic flood of the Low Countries in the early 12th century. Now, it could be that that's referring to a different wave of Flemish migration to that which William of Malmesbury talks about. So it could be that they're both talking about different waves of Flemish migration.
Flwyddyn yn ddiweddarach, anfonodd y brenin Harry I ddyfed, bobl o wreiddyn ac erferion rhyfedd, nad oedd dim ynghylch lle roeddent wedi ei cyddio ar yr ynys am flynyddoedd helaeth cyn hynny yn wybyddus. Meddianasant gatref cyfan o'r enw Rhos, ger llaw aber yr afon a enwyr yn cleddau, gan yrru'r holl drigolion o'i tiroedd. Ac roedd y bobl hynny wedi dod o Flandris, tir a orwedd ger llaw môr Prydain, gan fod y môr wedi llifo dros ei tiroedd a goroes gyn ei ffyniau a theini tywod dros y ddeiar a'i droi oll yn anffrwythlon. Ac o'r diwedd, gan nad oedd lle iddynt drigo ger yr arfordir o blegyd y môr, na chwaith yn y gefnfro oherwydd y niferoedd mawr o bobl a drygau yn eisoes, a chan nad oedd môr iddynt oll fyw yno a bod ynghyd. Deithant felly ac erfyn ar y brenin Harry am le I fyw a thrigondo, ac y fe a gyrasant i'r Rhos, ac yno y maint yn trigo gyda'r trigolion wedi colli ei tir.
Ond roedd y Ffleminwyr yma am beth bynnag reswm, ac yn barod i symud ymlaen gyda adeiladu cestyll fel Wyston a Hwlffordd, nyddu a gweu, achos roeddynt wedi dod â sgiliau ymryliw gyda nhw, a phrynu a gwerthu gyda bobl gartref a rhannau arall o'r wlad.
We don't know the numbers, but we know the names of the leaders like Leetard, Little King, Tankard, who founded Haverfordwest, Wiseau Flandrensis, who founded Wyston and others. And we know Wiseau came over slightly later on. So perhaps there must have still been some sort of communication between South West Wales and Flanders.
Wrth gwrs, byddai wedi ysgrifennu gartref yn dweud mor dda oedd popeth yma. Roedd gan y Normaniaid a'r Ffleminiaid lu o gestyll, a linell Lansger, i gadw y Cymru's rhwblus allan. Ond pam mae mwy o siaradwyr Cymraeg yn byw i'r gogledd o'r linell, and ond ychydig i'r de?
Haverford was founded by Tankard and his group of Flemish colonists in around about the early years of the 12th century, and Tankard was the leader of this first wave of Flemish migrants. They found a natural spot. The Half West Castle is 28 metres above the river level, so it's a beautiful rocky knoll, defensive, superb defensive site, and of course you've got a very wide river reaching this point. So it was a naturally defensive spot where Haverfordwest was eventually to grow up into the biggest town and also the biggest port in medieval Wales. In fact, before the Industrial Revolution.
Felly, rydyn ni wedi clywed am Tankard a Wiseau, ond roedd dyn arall, Godbert y Ffleminwr, a ddaeth yn berson pwysig iawn i ni. Yn ôl pob tebyg, ganwyd Godbert yng Nghastell Penfro yn 1994 neu 1996.
Godbert is a fascinating individual, and unfortunately we know so little about him. We know that he was born in Pembroke in 1096. We don't even know the names of his parents. Possibly we can conjecture that he was the son of a well-to-do Flemish mercenary captain. We don't know, an officer.
Godbert the Fleming is known mainly through his sons, but there is one reference to him in the earliest surviving pipe roll, that is Royal Accounts of 1130 under King Henry I. So he's mentioned in Pembrokeshire then, so we know he was there by 1130, but he's just this obscure name in a way. However, he seems to have been quite an important person in as much as his sons were knights involved in the English or Anglo-Welsh invasion of Ireland in the 1160s. And according to a Norman-French poem on that invasion, traditionally known as the Song of Dermot and the Earl, Richard Fitz-Godebert, Godebert's son, is said to have been the first to have gone over from Pembrokeshire to help the Irish King Dermot MacMurrough, who'd come over in 1167 seeking help to recover his kingdom of Leinster.
Mais Dermot, les gens tireis, od segereis, gens anglais, ne menade à Isel Tour, selon le 10 de mon contour. Ne, mais un Ricard, comme l'on dire, un chevalet de Pembroke-Sire. Le fils Godobert Ricard, chevalet hier de Bompard, chevalet, archer et sergent, mais je ne sais dès que et quand. Car ne jouerons longuement en Irlande et le gens, car ens ne peut profite faire, al rei guéresse en la terre. Pour ce que peut errant de gens, que passe astivement.
He was the only one to go over immediately, and the main bulk of troops went over 2 years later, 1169. So he was quite important in that and keen to take an advantage of that. And we also hear of a brother called Robert, I think Fitz-Godbert, in the poem a bit later on. But more than that, it's difficult to say on the tiny amount of contemporary evidence that survives.
A felly, dyna pam mae nifer o roaches yn dal yn Iwerddon. Cafodd Richard a Rodebert dir o gwmpas Wexford a Leinster, a sefydlodd Adam, mab hynaf Rodebert, dipyn o linarch. Talodd meibion Rodebert, Adam, Henry a David i adeiladu capel ar Ynys Begerin ym Mhorthladd Wexford i eneidiau ei tad a'i taid. Mewn fudiad y Normaniaid a ni'r Ffleminwyr, arweinwyd mewn amser i adeiladu St Jerome's yn Langum. Daeth gyda ni ein Cristnogaeth ein hunain, pabyddiaeth. Pidwch eich am ddeall, roedd y Cymru yn Gristnogion, ond yn wahanol. Roedd yma esgobion, ond roedd yr eglwysi Cymreig yn blaen ofnadwy i gymharu ar hyn a gawn ni nawr.
The early church in Pembrokeshire was fairly decentralised probably. There was a bishop at St David's from very early on, and we know that there were various local churches, some of which have early inscribed stones and sculpture and so on, which show that they were early, even though the buildings themselves are later. And they were organised probably under these bishops. There's a reference in the Welsh laws to bishop houses in Dyfed, which seem to have been centres that the bishops could go to. But it would be misleading, I think, to see this as a Celtic church completely separate from and independent of Rome. It was rather a more, if you like, conservative and old-fashioned church organisation by the 11th century, by the time of the Normans, compared to many other parts of Western Europe. But nevertheless, it was pretty orthodox and shared many of the features of the church elsewhere in Western Europe.
Y broblem yw, na wyddom rhyw lawer am yr eglwysi cynnar, achos ychydig iawn sydd wedi goroesi amser.
As far as the church itself is concerned, in its physical aspects, of course, there are a large number of medieval churches in Pembrokeshire. Unfortunately, on the one hand, they've been massively restored by the Victorians. On the other hand, they do not go back as far as the 11th or the 12th century. And in fact, there are churches in Wales which are very, very few from that period. The picture I have of the pre-conquest church is that you have these 7 bishop houses, as they're called, in Dyfed. One for each of the cantrefi, which were the lordships and the major administrative units before the Normans came, and survived as the hundreds right on until the 19th century in some form or other. So to try and get back, if you like, to the skeleton of the church before that is extremely difficult. I spent 40 years trying to do it, I still haven't got it right.
Wel, ac mae e'n esgob. Ar ôl dyfodiad y Normaniaid, datblygwyd system yr eglwysi lleol, ond nid ar lles crefydd yn aml iawn.
One of the fascinating things about, I suppose, the aftermath of the conquest, which was fairly bloody, and especially with the revolt and the harrying of the north and all of that stuff later, was that you get a lot of Norman lords founding monasteries, taking over Welsh mother churches to give to English monasteries, or building parish churches on their own land, churches which then became parish churches under their control. Why? It was guilt. It was expiation of guilt because they had shed blood. They were trying to get themselves right with God by actually doing that.
Yn ychwanegol i drio lleihau ei hamser mewn Prydain, roedd adeiladu eglwysi yn ffordd dda o gadw'r bobl o dan reolaeth. A beth am deulu y Dylaroshes? Adeiladodd Adam, wir Godebert, Pill Priory, ar bwys Aberdegleddau. Ac yna, yn ddiweddarach, adeiladodd y teulu eglwys St Jerome a oedd yn cymryd lle eglwys Geltaidd gynharach. Yn ddiweddarach, yn y 4edd ganrif ar 10, adeiladodd y teulu ran newydd i'r eglwys, gan roi capel ar yr ochr ogleddol. Roedd yn gapel gyda effeiriad preifat i'r teulu, allan o olwg gweddill yr eglwys. Posh ynde? Roedd yn bosib i'r teulu wylio'r gwasanaeth yng nghorff yr eglwys drwy dwll bach, sgwynt. Wel, doedd dim posib cymysgu gyda'r bobl leol. Yn ychwanegol i'r eglwys, roedd angen adeiladu lle i fyw a magu teuluoedd, a dylai'n cyndadau fod yn falch iawn o'i gwaith. Roedd un rhan o'r teulu eisoes yn byw yng Nghastell Roch, ac hefyd roedd Castell Benton, llety hela a oedd yn edrych allan dros yr afon. Adeiladodd y teulu faenor bach ar y ffordd allan o Langum, ond roedd pethau nawr yn dechrau newid.
By the end of the 13th and into the 14th century, the Pembrokeshire had changed. Clearly, it was much more settled, and especially after the Edwardian conquest of Wales, in a sense, finally made sure there would be no more danger from the Welsh. And through into the 14th and 15th century, that was generally true, apart from briefly in the early 15th century, the rising of Owain Glyndwr, which did create a lot of destruction across many parts of Wales, including into Pembrokeshire. But more generally, society had, if you like, become more stable and in a way more like society in England, I think, in southern Pembrokeshire, with the villages and the manorial lords and so on. So that this was much less a militarised society, much less a frontier society than it had been when the Normans and Flemings had first come at the end of the 11th and the beginning of the 12th century.
Mae hyn I gyd yn iawn, ond siarad am y crachach ydyn ni. Beth amdano ni, y bobl sy'n gwneud y gwaith I gyd?
How society was, how the lives of ordinary people is really difficult to fathom because we've got so few sources of information. What we can say with certainty was it was a feudal society, it was hierarchical, where the lords of the various manors of Pembrokeshire would have held sway. There would have been little kings in their own right. As far as livelihoods are concerned, the vast majority of people are working on the land, labour intensive, or of course with 186 miles of coastline, it would have been traders or fishermen, merchants and that sort of thing.
Dyna fe, ni yn gwneud y gwaith I gyd, a nhw yn byw fel brenin. Ond roedd bywyd yn gwella.
I think what we can probably say with confidence is by 1400, the 300 years had seen a great deal of economic growth. They'd seen a lot of urbanisation in Pembrokeshire. For example, the growth of towns like Haverfordwest, Pembroke, Tenby. They were now proper boroughs in their own right with walled towns, merchant classes. Population of Pembrokeshire, we don't know, but it was obviously a much bigger population because of economic growth. So that 300 years is one of growth and I think of increasing prosperity.
Newyddion da I ni wrth gwrs, achos nawr gyda gwaith hiw fel masnachwr gwlân, mae'n bosib prynu tir. Dyma ni yn y ddogfen yma yn rhentu tir allan am rent bach, un nodwydd haearn y flwyddyn dwi'n meddwl. Mae'n henwau yn Lladin hefyd, Hugo a Mabella. Mae'n swnio'n rhyfedd iawn ond yw. Ond roedd Hwlffordd yn le cyffroes iawn I fyw yn yr adeg yma.
Historians are very hard-pressed to describe social structures in early societies, and in a time when there were no census records, no diaries, it's very difficult to actually get the social structure of a place like Pembrokeshire in the early modern period. All I can say is that most of the records that have survived are almost exclusively dealing with taxation, exchequer returns, property transactions, but we do get the names of people, and it's a remarkably rich mix of cosmopolitan names, Welsh names, English names, Norse, Flemish, and so it's a cosmopolitan community. How the dynamics worked was, one would imagine that the sort of Norman barons with their Flemish mercenaries, they would have obviously controlled the levers of power, but how it actually worked further down is very difficult to describe because of the paucity of records.
Felly, yn y farchnad, mae'n bosib clywed amryw o wahanol ieithoedd yn cael ei siarad. Ond ar y cyfan, mae bobl yn gyrru ymlaen yn dda iawn.
We have good evidence for society in South Wales at the end of the 12th century from Gerald of Wales, who came from the area, and he makes clear that there are several groups. There are the Welsh, there are the people like himself who are of, if you like, Norman ancestry, but have settled in Wales and intermarried to some extent with the Welsh. And there are the Flemings, who stand out as a distinctive group, though they also married into Norman families, at least, though not with the Welsh as far as we can see. And there's clearly interaction between these different groups, presumably with trade at the boroughs like Haverfordwest. It was necessary, even though that was run probably by the Flemings, for people of, if you like, Norman and Welsh descent to go and interact with them.
Ond dyna fi eto, yn neidio ymlaen. Un flwyddyn, 1315 dwi'n meddwl, rhyw 100 mlynedd ar ôl adeiladu St Jerome's, digwyddodd rhywbeth eitha hyfryd yn y pentre. Priododd Sir David de la Roche, y pennaeth yn Langum, ac un o ddisgynyddion Godbert y Fflaminwyr, a'r glwyddes Joanna a ddaeth o gangen arall o'r teulu de la Roche. Roedd emni'r genod yn gyffrous iawn. Roedd ei theulu hi wedi trefnu'r brodas pan oedd hi oddeutu 12 oed, gyda cytuneb, cynhysgaeth a thir. Roedd Sir David wedi talu blaendal, ac os oedd ei newid ei feddwl, byddai yn colli ei arian a llawer mwy. Yn wir. Cyn y briodas, roedd Joanna wedi ymolchi mewn olew persawrus, coluro ei hwyneb a lliwio ei gwallt, a'r wisg briodas, wisg sidan gyda brodwaith aur a choron o flodau yn ei gwallt. Roedd yn fendigedig. Roedd Sir David yn edrych yn olygus hefyd. Priodasant tu allan i ddrws yr eglwys gyda Joanna yn sefyll ar y chwith, achos wrth gwrs, cafodd merched ei creu allan o asen chwith adda. Mae'n od iawn, ond yw. Diolch byth na chymerwyd y cyfan. Wedyn, roedd gwasanaeth hir iawn yn yr eglwys. Ar ôl y cyfan, cawsam amser bendigedig gyda gwledd fawr a cerddor yn diddanu pawb. Daeth pawb at ei senau bach gyda nhw, a rhoddwyd y cyfan gyda'i gilydd i wneud un deisen briodas fawr. Wrth gwrs, doedd dim gwahoddiad i ni, dim ond y crachach, ond roedd cyfle i ni wylio o'r tu allan. Ac yna, yn union cyn hanner nos, dinynodd y gwesteion David a Joanna a'i rhoi i'r gwely gyda diod y briodferch. Sgwn i pwy oedd y cynlluniwr. Beth bynnag, roedd pawb eisiau i David a Joanna fyw bywyd hir a hapus. Roedd hi mor brydferth ar ddydd ei phriodas, ac roedd ei'n edrych yn olygus iawn hefyd, ond oedd hyn ddim i fod. Cawsant un plentyn, Robert, yn 1316, ond bu farw Joanna ar ei enedigaeth, trienni. Bu farw Robert yn ifanc hefyd, a cymerwyd ei fab John i mewn i deulu ei frodryb Isabel. Nhw fydd yn gwneud y penderfyniadau ynglŷn â'i fagwriaeth, bod ei fam yn dal yn fyw. Roedd John i ffwrdd yn aml iawn, a phenderfynodd y teulu i greu delw hyfryd o Robert i wneud yn siŵr fod neb yn ei anghofio. Roedd yn ddrud iawn, a cafodd ei osod yn eglwys St Jerome. Os ydi talu am ddelweddau yn lleu'r amser mewn Pyrdan, gobeithio ei fod wedi gweithio i'r teulu yma. Aeth y blynyddoedd ymlaen, gyda rhai pethau yn newid ac eraill yn aros. Enghraifft, ar ôl yr holl flynyddoedd, roedd pobl yn dal i siarad eu ieithoedd eu hunain.
We know that one of Gerald of Wales's brothers spoke Flemish to one of the prominent Flemish leaders of the time. So this was a world of different peoples who are interacting in different contexts.
Daliodd Hugh i siarad Flemeg am amser maith. Roedd yn rhaid iddo pan yn masnachu gyda masnachwyr glân yn y famwlad. Cadwodd pawb at yr hen arferion. Mae pawb yn gwybod fod posibilrwydd rhagfynegu'r dyfodol trwy ferwi llafn ysgwydd dafad. Roedd un gŵr a ddaeth i ymweld, yn credu fod pobl yn deall Flemeg am amser ar ôl hyn.
Lucas de Heer, who came to Pembrokeshire in 1567-1577, he records that he was able to converse with a number of families in a form of Flemish. Now that is a absolutely remarkable survival. If that's the case, they came here in the 12th century, and that means that they were still able to retain the essence of their identity into the reign of Queen Elizabeth I.
Felly, mae'r de la Roches yn cario ymlaen ar ei ffordd ei hunain hyd at John de la Roche. Cofiwch, dyma mab Robert, yr hwn sy'n cael ei gofio trwy'r ddelw yn yr eglwys. Mae'n ddrwg da fi os ydych chi'n gymleth i ddeilyn y teulu yma. Beth bynnag, Priododd John ferch o'r enw Elizabeth de Birmingham a symudodd y teulu i ganolbarth Lloegr, felly dyna ddiwedd ei hanes e. Priododd ei gyfnither Margaret Fleming, o'r enw Sir Roger de Clarendon, ond bu farw Margaret yn 1382. Doedd bobl ddim yn gadarn iawn yn yr amser yma. Roedd hi'n ifanc iawn, dim ond 11 oed, felly roedd yn briod ac yn word iddo. Cymleth iawn ond yw. Criodd hyn broblem fawr i Sir Roger, achos doedd dim posibilrwydd iddo fe etifeddu tir y de la Roches.
Sir Roger de Clarendon is a really interesting individual. He was an illegitimate son of the Black Prince, who of course, and his father was King Edward III. And in fact, the Black Prince had sired 3 illegitimate sons by the time he was 19. So such was the mores and behaviour of princes of the blood. They could get away with that sort of thing. But Sir Roger was interesting because he was married to Margaret de la Roche. And, you know, if it wasn't for the fact that she had predeceased him, he would have come into possession of the De La Roche land and obviously had that direct link himself with places like Langum.
Drian o Sir Roger, ond mae pethau yn mynd o ddrwg I waith.
Sir Roger de Clarendon, obviously being a half-brother of Richard II, would have been in danger when Bolingbroke became King Henry IV, and of course we find in 1402 Sir Roger being hanged. Could have been a trumped-up charge that he was spreading rumours that Richard II was still alive. Bolingbroke, Henry IV, knew that wasn't true because, of course, he'd had Richard II starved to death in Pontefract Castle. But, you know, they didn't really need sort of much due process of law, and so he had him hanged in 1402.
Dyna ofnadwy. Ond dyna ni, dyna'r stori. Bu farw llinarch y de la Roches gyda marwolaeth Margaret, a throsglwydded y tir i'r 4 cefnder. Ar ôl y gwaith I gyd, symud o Flandris, codi ffortiwn a theulu, mae'r gangen yma a'r teulu yn dod I ben trwy farwolaeth un ferch. Ond wrth gwrs, mae Roches yn dal yn Iwerddon, ac wel, roedd mam y dywysoges Diana yn un o'r teulu Roche yn wreiddiol. Mae eraill yn byw yn Wiltshire, Cernyw, Gwlad yr Haf ac yn Yswyth, ar ôl i'r merched briodi a symud gyda cangen y teulu. A pwy fyddai'n meddwl fod y cyfan wedi ei greu o un teulu? Un dyn o bosib, Godbert a'i ddisgynyddion, a ddaeth yn Fitz-Godbert ac yna Roche. Cymerodd rhain ei lle yng Nghymru, ochr yn ochr â theuluoedd Flemaidd, Normanaidd ac eraill ar draws Ewrop. Ac fel oedd y marchnad Hwlffordd yn y canol oesoedd, mae pawb yn gyrru ymlaen yn iawn, wel y rhan fwyaf o'r amser.